There's a whole section of the area here where they lock down the entire area of where, migrant workers were living in very cramped and in sanitary conditions. Um, and their jobs basically are, I have a friend in there and they're locked down, and he's telling me that their company is saying they're not going to pay them, even the very little that they make. So
Yeah, I heard, so came across an article, I think describing people in Qatar, these sort of migrant workers basically having to beg for food now. Is that becoming a reality more and more, or is this something?
well, I saw this in the Guardian, and yeah, I saw that article. I think I'm not sure how accurately that statement or that headline represents it. You know, they had an area there which is under lockdown, and they were providing food and stuff, meals and everything to them. So I wasn't sure, when the headline. I haven't seen people. There's always been people begging here. You know what I mean? Just like in any city, you'll drive up and there will be somebody and he will have a kind of a bandage on his chest. This was a common thing, and then but I don't think that anybody starves here. There's plenty of food, and there's a kind of a culture of generosity, right? I mean, so especially during Ramadan, there's iftar foods and big iftar tents that are set up, and people can go and get food.
But this is obviously pre-lockdown.
I don't know how that will
So the Ramadan tents are current during the course of this sort of lockdown.
No, not now. This is earlier time.
Yeah.
But during this time they had Ramadan. They had iftar that's served at in the lockdown place.
Yeah.
According to the report from my friend in there.
Oh, good.
He's from Kenya and he's not Muslim, but he says, we go to the mosque and then they're given meals, right?
Oh, good.
He's also the one that told me that their company is, saying they're not going to pay them during this time. So the basis of my information, then, it looked to me, and also reading the article, that the description of them like begging was basically that they're needing to go to charity places where they're giving meals because of the fact that the companies are not paying them.
Yeah. And then the fact that it's sort of, as you're saying, there's a lot of charity that is given just by virtue of, it's obviously written into the Islamic books, right? The import. So that helps tremendously, and historically, right? This has always been the case, as far as I can tell, in all traditional cultures, as it were. There's a fundamental the idea of charities is fundamental to all the traditions, right? That it's kind of a religious obligation to give to the poor and to give to the less fortunate. And as far as I can tell, also that's how these different societies functioned throughout history and also got through all sorts of circumstances, right? Even in very poor countries today, in contemporary times, the society, the sort of interfamilial connections are so deep that's how people still survive on very minimal amounts of income, oftentimes. But that's very heartening to hear, because one reads these articles, obviously from sitting in a Western context or what have you, come across these articles on Facebook, and you think, oh my God, the world is going to hell, and it kind of is going to hell as well. But
well, that's the real problem, because actually things are not perfect, and there are real problems. You know what I mean? But the nature of the problems that are real are not always as presented, by the media. Right? Like in this example in the Guardian article, and I'm not sure, when I read the Guardian articles or other articles like that, I know that like the Gulf states are having a kind of a feud between each other, and some of this is being played out in the Western media, and they're trying to make each other look bad in the Western media, right? So they will accuse each other of different kinds of violations, which
That's
at the same
fascinating.
time,
Yeah.
Arabs are kind of known for. So you'll find that, they'll accuse each other of, treating workers like slaves. They'll accuse each other of mistreating women. And they all do these things. You see what I mean? And at the same time, they all accuse each other of these things in front of a
Interesting.
Western audience. You see what I'm saying?
So it's not
And
always the case that it's necessarily as bad as it's presented, and nor is it not always the case that the people making the accusations, well, if one Arab nation is accusing another Arab nation. I mean, speaking of the feuds, right? Qatar, can you say a little bit about Qatar? Because Qatar is, I don't know enough at all. I mean, other than a couple of things that I do know, which I really appreciate about Qatar, is Al Jazeera is doing fascinating work, has been for a really long time now. I remember when Al Jazeera English started, um, whenever it was now, 2001, 2002, I can't remember, thereabouts. I was just floored by the quote unquote objectivity of its news reporting, the really heavyweight reporters that they had brought in. And I remember commenting to my then wife, that it was also an academic, I was saying to her, it's because there's some confusion, I think, early on, and some people still view Al Jazeera with degrees of suspicion. But I said to her, Al Jazeera is just like the journalist's dream, that as far as objective, quote unquote objective reporting. And then I subsequently heard from someone who knew a little bit more about the inner workings of Al Jazeera, that apparently the general guidelines to journalists in Al Jazeera is you can say whatever you want about whomever you want, as long as it's not about Qatar, like negatively, which is interesting, right? It's propaganda is a fascinating propaganda and news media and whatever comes under that.
And even you do find sometimes articles in Al Jazeera about Qatar,
Critical of Qatar.
And but in a very controlled way, I think, in the way which I'm assuming that the idea here is to sort of promote the reputation for objectivity of Al Jazeera, right?
Yeah.
But at the same time, let's say, not to go too far, because I don't think that they can say anything they want to about Qatar, but there's a certain kind of controlled criticism. I've seen this in Singapore also, even more, maybe more, at the same time, more evident and sometimes more involved, where there's a kind of a controlled criticism. There's like an opposition which is there to voice opposition in such a way that it gives the appearance that the government is, sort of allowing people to critique it. Yeah. And maybe it actually, in Singapore, I think they even think of it as serving the function of keeping government ministers on their toes. You see what I mean? But it has to be, you see what I mean? But it has to be in a kind of a controlled way, which doesn't, in their view, I guess, undermine the stability of the society. You see what I mean?
Yeah. So news reporting and journalism and knowledge, right? Knowledge production. This is something I think a lot about. Something I know you think a lot about as well. As far as, on the one hand, being able to have the freedom to say what wants to say what one wants to say about things, sort of being objective, and then at the same time there's a framework within which, right, as you describing Qatar and Singapore, but I think somehow this is almost always a problem, right, of knowledge production, that there are certain parameters. And Chomsky, I remember saying this I remember reading him in some interview with David Barsamian going many years back. He was saying that this is the problem with, in his sort of critique of the liberal media, right, that liberal Western media, that the framework is already predetermined. You're allowed to fight and disagree and what have you as much as you want, but within those fixed parameters. And he makes mention of the example in the Vietnam War, that you had famously the Doves versus the Hawks, and the Doves wanting to pull out, the Hawks wanting to stay in. And Chomsky's point was, at no point did either of those sides say, well, you know, our very presence in Vietnam to begin with was a problem, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's fascinating how these parameters are set up. And as you know, one of my teachers in all of this, someone you know, I consider to be indispensable to think through what it means to certainly be a modern subject, is Michel Foucault, and his sort of formulation of power knowledge. As far as knowledge production is concerned right now, and at all times, but the sort of hot topic of discussion right now is around coronavirus, is around the pandemic. There are certain parameters that I can see quite clearly. There's certain things that can be said, right, and certain things that can't be said. And if one strays beyond a certain acceptable framework of discussion, then people are sort of immediately labeled all sorts of things. And it's fascinating also to me to think through this problem as it's still unfolding, a problem, you know, in a sort of philosophical sense, that those parameters are almost, it's not like anyone set out the parameters and said, this is what you can say and what you can't say, but people almost intuitively know. But it's fascinating to think through. What are some of your thoughts on this issue?
Well, I guess I'd like to ask you,
Yeah.
what do you think those parameters are now? Because when you got me thinking about it, it seemed to me like the parameters are, the issue of parameters is very different now than it was in the Vietnam War time, and even I think all the way up until just recently. And so we have perhaps a crisis of parameters. Like it doesn't seem like there's a sort of sovereign unitary authority over what the parameters are now. So we do have this issue of parameters, but when I ask myself, what are the things that can't be said about COVID? I cannot think of anything that cannot be said about COVID, which is not just something that cannot be said in a certain company. You know what I mean? You know, in the red state or the blue state, so to speak.
This is interesting. Yeah, this is a good point. Yeah.
In the blue state, so to speak. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
and I'm trying to ask myself, is there anything that still can't be said in any sort of company in American society?
As far as COVID is concerned, that's an interesting. So something. Maybe I can try to respond to your question in a sort of oblique fashion. So, I mean, I'm very freewheeling when it comes to sort of where I consume my information from, and I try to really expose myself to as vast array of different perspectives, as wacky sounding as they may seem, as totally sort of mainstream or what have you, and there are all sorts of theories out there, obviously, right, as far as this particular this current issue is concerned. It's interesting for me, to your point, and that's a very that's a pertinent point, which is still unfolding, right? That, as you put it, it doesn't seem, it's not clear that nothing is beyond the pale, somewhat, right? As far as making pronouncements on this. At the same time, there is. I've been following certain cases of people who are actually being banned from YouTube, like literally people who come under the rubric of conspiracy theorist. Someone like David Icke, for instance, who has some really way out there ideas, right? He's famously known as sort of saying, you know, talking about the lizard people controlling the world, which is really, I mean, it's interesting, right? And to put it mildly. At the same time, he has had over the years a very significant following online on YouTube and things like that, and he's been deplatformed, which is really interesting. So clearly, and put in specifically to do with COVID, and sort of YouTube's official policy as it's been outlined in recent weeks by you know, one of the sort of figureheads. Can't remember I can't remember her name right now. She basically said any views that aren't in keeping with the WHO's perspective on COVID, they will be banned. So apparently there are certain things that can't be said. And of course, you know, this is in the nature of this is in the nature of the working out of things, where there are always sort of ways in which seemingly heretical ideas manage to come through. Another interesting character, and these are characters who are way out there, right? But again, I really like to listen to as many people as I can, because, you know, I'm a thinking, intelligent human being like yourself. Why not? Like, what's the harm? Just to see what Alex Jones is a fascinating, really way out there character, right? Who Trump himself publicly acknowledged as having helped him win the election. That's not a small thing, right? Alex Jones was one of the first people to be deplatformed pre-COVID. He was deplatformed like 2 or 3 years ago from YouTube. And he's like very anti-liberal media, very anti, you know, the globalist agenda, as he sort of likes to describe it. And interestingly enough, as far as, and this is kind of a very Foucauldian take on things as well, because Foucault very typically is depicted as saying, well, you know, there's discourse, this sort of power-ridden mode of thinking in the world, and beyond that, nothing is possible. But Foucault actually was very interested also in how power itself is productive of other forms of knowledge and expression, which sometimes go against the sort of the dominant thing. In any case, so Alex Jones now, according to his own testimony, I guess, according to his own numbers, he is bigger now than ever before, which is fascinating, right? Anyway, so that was a bit of a kind of a long-winded response. But
doesn't that kind of pose the question to
yeah,
it goes back to the question: is there anything that you cannot that is unspeakable in every sphere of society like before? Because we now have 2 spheres of society, and the fact that a guy got kicked off YouTube does not silence him anymore. Actually, in fact, there's a whole other section of society in which what is the unspeakable thing is to say that he was rightfully kicked off of YouTube because he was spreading, subversion or something, right?
Subversion or dangerous views, as it's put sometimes, right? Yeah.
That would be something that could not be said in such a. So there's not really one sphere anymore. It doesn't seem where
this is true.
What is limited, it can sort of what can be said can be limited in a comprehensive way.
Yeah, well, which is in keeping, if this is the case, and I would tend to agree with you, but I do have certain question marks at the same time. If that is the case, as you just described it, then that would be in keeping with how the original sort of developers of the internet wanted it to happen, right? That they described this sort of very democratic sphere where literally anyone and everyone can express their views.
Right.
At the same time, I think there has been over the years, and the issue of YouTube does speak to this, right? Where there has been a massive consolidation of power, and increasingly so amongst certain specific players, YouTube being owned by Google, Facebook, these big sort of tech, they're called the Big Five, I remember reading a couple of years ago. So Google, Facebook, Microsoft, of course, Apple, and there was a fifth one. I don't know if you might remember which that fifth one was. And what's being pointed out now more sort of in more recent years is that these big five companies are having a massive influence on actually shaping public perceptions on things for the better and for the worse. And these things are never black and white, of course. And this is a problem. And what people are saying also, that the original intentionality behind digitality as being this open free market of ideas and self-expression, what have you, that hasn't really come to pass. And I wonder to what extent that is in the unfortunate nature of human nature and technologies that what starts off as being very revolutionary and democratizing is then co-opted by the powers that be, and there's this massive. I don't know. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I guess it seems to me that it seems like it may come down to a basic misunderstanding, or let's say, not misunderstanding, but a design flaw, let's say, the concept of freedom that has been that it was operative from the very beginning with regard to the expectation.
I like that phrasing, design flaw vis-a-vis the very idea of freedom. Could you unpack that, please? Yeah.
Well, I'm not sure what I'm going to find when I unpack it, but I'm just going to start from the surface and the description of things as it is, right? It's true at the same time, as you say, that the actual main large sources of media are controlled by fewer and fewer companies, right? Like, there are fewer and fewer hands. Yeah. And so, but at the same time, it does seem like the parameters of discourse really are breaking down. And when I say that the parameters of discourse are breaking down, that doesn't necessarily mean that we have more democracy and more freedom. What it means, for example, is that in Michigan, an armed militia stormed into the state assembly, with heavy weapons, and basically obstructed the operation of the government. You see what I mean? And because of the fact that there's these people now, and this is basically considered to be acceptable. Basically, I can remember not many years ago when such a thing would be actually unspeakable. That would be intolerable. How can we just allow people to go in and obstruct the operations of our government? But now it's okay because of the fact that large numbers of people don't even see that as our government. You see what I mean? Now there's a bunch of people who have gotten used to this thing, and it's become part of the culture war. You see what I mean? Like, look at you, white rednecks, you're going there waving your guns around. You see what I mean? It's not really the gravity of it, even by these people, to me, it's not really taken in its full extent to what it is. You know what I'm saying? You go on and you see some kind of memes or some kind of stuff where people are criticizing the Trump crowd because look what they go wave around their guns like kids. And okay, that's true. You should criticize them for that. But the thing is actually much more serious than even that.
It is. Yeah. Can you unpack how it's? Yeah.
It is, and it makes me feel like, you really do feel like there's like a childish fight between two factions now. There's not one society and one government there that is even left. Nobody has a conception of such a thing, so that you could say this is a real crisis. These people have obstructed the operations of our democracy, because there's no such thing as an our democracy to obstruct anymore. You see what I'm saying? And it seems like, so it does seem, and again, I'm looking at it, I'm looking at the news in the US and the way that you're reading the Qatar and the Guardian. You see what I mean? What is it like? I haven't been there.
Right. Do you think? Do you think?
Government has.
Yeah. Do you think people have been speculating for a few years now, right, of the potential, the possibility of there being a civil war in the US? Does that seem like a possibility for you? Or?
Well, I remember when nobody would have said anything like that except as a sci-fi or as a joke or some kind of dystopian future plot. Now, I don't think many people would say that it's so likely, but it's something that you could actually read about it would not be inappropriate to read such an idea being considered or warned about, for example, in a mainstream respectable publication.
Right. So mainstream respectable liberal publication on one hand, and also, well, that's interesting how language works, right? Because I'm very, maybe a little hyper sensitive to language. I mean, my background's in English, but then also Foucault and things like that. But so mainstream, respectable liberal media outlets would have a certain way of warning about that potentially, right? And then these sort of less respectable redneck type of language is fascinating, right? As I mean, to use your language, I mean, it's not a critique, but this type of language is used all the time. So the sort of less respectable redneck type of media figures, Alex Jones being one of these sort of redneck types, he's been saying, I mean, the last time I heard him was a few weeks ago. I don't sort of listen to him that regularly, but the last time I checked in on him, he was very, very fearful for the future of his country, very fearful for the future of his family and sort of God-fearing people like himself, that if need be, you know, as he's described himself as having done over the years, he's kind of, he's quite well armed, I believe, and you know, he sort of says he has his own sort of self-contained. Obviously, he's very wealthy, so very large expanse of land. There is a deep fear in amongst these sort of people on the right, and one may say wrongly and rightly that these fears, let's say, to put it like this, and I, as far as self-identification, it's very hard to self-identify with any faction, right? When it's so black and white or blue and red, right? And I'm not American anyway, but in any case, I don't see myself as totally liberal or totally conservative or anything. Like, I mean, I just try to make sense of things as best I can in any situation. But there's a very, what I sense to be a very real fear, at least in their minds, amongst these sort of people on the right in the US, vis-a-vis these very, as they describe them as being, these liberal, anti-theistic, anti so many things, as they tend to cast it, modes of looking at the world and being in the world. Right? They talk about the globalist agenda, this sort of one world government, and all this stuff, very sci-fi sounding, very conspiracy theory. But from as far as an anthropological perspective is concerned, like, we have to take seriously what people are saying just to try and make sense of things, right? Whether we accept it or not is irrelevant, right? I'm not sure why I went on that tangent, but I forget why I went on that tangent, but I'd like to hear your sort of thoughts in general, or or to do with anything to do with what I just said.
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, it does seem to me like kind of anarchy. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I take to heart your sensitivity to language. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's true that, and I think the problem is, part of the problem is that this distinction or the difference between the appearance of being mainstream, you know what I mean, and actual objectivity, right, is growing. So the liberal media doesn't seem as objective as it used to seem, and sort of its biases seem to be showing more because of the fact of the polarization. I mean, basically because of the fact that there isn't a kind of a single paradigm that everybody's sort of working under when they discuss things in society.
Yeah.
By your very entrance to the discussion, you're automatically entering on one side or another, right? There's not like any center. So that means that automatically, I mean, no matter what CNN says, it's going to be, you know what I mean, sort of biased against Trump just because it's not for Trump. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I mean, if you want to put it in a way, it's, if you and want to be poetic about it, sometimes I do, because I have grudges that I try to keep aside and not let them sort of push my analysis of the issue. You see what I mean?
Sure.
But I remember when this country was all on the same page. You know, I remember when this country was on the same page, and their page was, you know, Islam is the enemy, and we need to eradicate Islam, and you know, separate the good ones from the bad ones. And Bush came out and said to the world, you're either with us or you're with the terrorists. And what you're seeing now is that Americans are saying that to each other. They said it to the rest of the world, and now they're
Wow.
blowing themselves apart because they're all saying it to each other. You're either with us or you're with the enemy. You see what I mean? And so there's no possible way for having a mainstream media. CNN has to be biased because it has to be on one side of another. Now, that's my vindictive, poetic way of looking at it, but I don't want the country to go this way. You know what I mean?
It'll be tragic for, it'll be,
Look at this.
yeah,
You know, look,
yeah,
it's like it could be a play. This could be the third act of a play. And the first act started with Bush telling everybody, you know, you're with us, you're with us.
yeah. Oh my God.
And it could start with them bringing up Muslims and saying, do you, you know, accept American values or not?
Yeah.
Right? And then the second act is one American saying to another, what are American values in the first place? And the third act is what we see right now. The third act is what we see right now.
Yeah.
Now they can't decide what American values are, and it's split because that was already there from the beginning. You know what I mean? And it's related to some of the things that we were planning to talk about with the idea of the medicalization of moral authority and moral reality.
All of that was, believe it or not, I mean, I kind of started off with the intention of bringing it to that. So maybe you could speak a little bit to that, a little more to that, to the question of the medicalization of moral authority, because just to kind of recap a few salient points about what we've discussed so far. We started off by talking about the media and you know, the parameters of the discussion, where there are any set parameters anymore. We spoke a little bit about well, I'm kind of not in order here, but just now you spoke about the question of red states versus blue states, or liberals versus conservatives in the US. And whether the center can hold anymore. And from what you're saying, from what I'm hearing, from what I'm seeing also, is it seems that the center isn't holding anymore. And playing into all of this, COVID, or rather COVID is playing something of a significant role in all of this, because we have the sort of liberal media saying a certain thing about COVID, and it's very much sort of in keeping with the WHO's standards of advice and so forth. On the other hand, we have the sort of conservative media, Fox and others. They're really questioning that media, that liberal media narrative, and so what was the phrase that you which you just mentioned, and I totally forgot already because you mentioned it before, the politicization of the politicization of medical knowledge, is that how you put it? Or
well,
no,
that's
no.
too.
Those are my own biases, kind of thing. No,
I was thinking about the medicalization.
The medicalization of
public moral reality, or public
moral reality. Sorry, no, let's go with that.
Yeah, you could. I could use the public moral authority because really it is a kind of a crisis of a moral authority that is, I think, there at the core of it. But I think it's also we can call it a crisis of moral reality, or public moral reality, right? And I think this is because the problem is because we are sort of ingrained. Now, this is one of those things. If we wanted to look for something which is unspeakable across the entire political spectrum, it may actually be just the proposition that in the public sphere, some moral values have to be imposed on everybody. Maybe it's still one of the sacred cows that, you know what I mean, that moral values are separable from secular scientific issues, and that they can be relegated to the private sphere, so that, you know, the individual conscience is the only sovereign that you know what I mean, can decree, make decisions that are moral in nature. And so that the public sphere becomes one that's completely neutral, somehow, so this is a big project and there's so many roles and everybody has tried to theorize this way, but this is the aim, the goal of a public sphere, which is value neutral, right? But we see that the COVID crisis brings to the fore certain decisions that have to be made, which are irreducibly moral. They're irreducibly value decisions, value judgments. We have to decide what to close and what not to close, for example. And that's a decision as to what in society, what in our shared human life, it's not personal human life, it's a shared social human life. What aspects of our shared human life are valuable enough that it's worth continuing even at the risk of public health, right? And which are not valuable enough that it's worth that risk and should be shut down. So what the risk is completely not in question. I mean, let's say that the doctors are all correct, and I'm not here, and any of the things I say here, I don't want to be taken as a kind of contributing to the sort of distrust that, the medical establishment is trying to take up the world or something. I don't believe that. But what I am saying is that we do have decisions being made that are moral in nature, and that decisions are being sort of questioned as they could be in a democratic society, not by taking your guns to the state building, but by discourse. You see what I mean? But why are the guns going to the state building? Because whenever there's a chance for discussion, we're told, listen to the medical experts. But it's actually not a medical decision. It's not a scientific question. It's a moral question. Now, that's assuming that there's this real distinction. And I don't believe that in reality, that distinction, I think, is pernicious. But our society is based on that distinction. And we haven't trained doctors.
Between the moral and the medical.
Yeah. I mean, we haven't trained our doctors in a way. We don't have a medical profession which is tied to a metaphysical paradigm and a moral paradigm in such a way that it can give us a story about not only how to do the things that we want to do with the human body, but actually what we ought to do with the human body, what it's for, what human life is for. If we actually had a holistic kind of knowledge, then it makes sense that we might be able to ask Dr. Fauci not only what kinds of activities are highest risk for spreading the epidemic, but he could also be in a position to tell us what activities in life are most important for a flourishing in human life, and what are not as important, what is essential and what is not essential, because your idea of the human being and your idea of medicine would be tied to this kind of knowledge. You see what I'm saying? But that's not the way it is. And so what we are doing is we're having people, a section of society we can call the blue state section, which basically are sometimes it seems in a position of imposing their value judgments on the whole of society, but then doing so under the cover of a kind of amoral technocratic sort of authority.
Yes.
Like listen to the scientific experts, listen to the medical, and the people that are talking to are frustrated because I don't think that the right-wing people they're talking to, they only feel that somebody is taken, that they have no power in the society, because they don't feel that their values are taken seriously. I don't think they really see the nature of the problem, because they also still buy into this kind of, I can do anything I want to as long as I don't hurt anybody else, and that's the American formula kind of idea. So whenever they try to make their case, they always try to make it in those terms, right? When they want to impose their values on society, right, their religious values on society, they always say that if they're not able to, that means that their religious rights are being infringed. You see what I mean? They have to always put it in that same framework of individual rights and individual freedom, because they also are buying into this fallacy, I think, right? Which is if the public sphere somehow, well, maybe they don't want the public sphere to be neutral, but they definitely want there to be a private sphere of which they're the soft. And they want it to be as big as they can make it, right? Yeah. So, yeah, there we have it. And that's, I guess, what I think about the medicalization of public moral reality is a kind of a phenomena that we're seeing now with the COVID crisis. And I do feel like I sense that among liberals online, and this Facebook people, they do their cute little thing in their house. I'm staying at home. Look, we sewed some masks, and oh, look, I'm gaining weight. and all I do is watch Netflix. But that's cool because I'm doing it
saving
for
the world.
COVID. I mean, they're excited about this. You can tell they love it, right? They're not out of a job. You see what I mean? They're not worried. But there's other people that they don't feel it the same way. You have to look at people who have a different situation than you. You can't just look at it for yourself. Now, and there's something that I feel like they're embracing it for some reason. And I guess my hypothesis is that subconsciously they're embracing this sort of new COVID reality because it eases this crisis of moral authority that's under there. They actually can just submit to the doctors, and they can say that, listen to the doctors. It's like they need a moral authority, but secularism leaves this vacuum of it. They feel the need. And when the situation there emerges where they can sort of put Dr. Fauci or medical experts on a kind of a pedestal, right? Of being, the moral authority. Yeah. Then it sort of eases that thing. They now have a kind of a leader. They now have some leaders. The other guys have Trump. He's a kook, right? And they think he's sent by Jesus or whatever, right? But they don't have any moral authority. We're just so if somebody says, "Oh, the doctors can do it," but the doctors can't do it. It's just that it's the medicalization of moral authority that I see here is just sort of the concentrated version, the sort of logical conclusion of a phenomenon that has been for a long time going in lighter, more subtle ways, whereby, moral judgments are sort of imposed or made under the guise of amoral rubrics of authority and amoral systems of reality, but they're actually moral judgments. And they try to move away from and evade from the fact that these judgments are moral because they're always trying to position themselves as taking the neutral position. Right? And gives them that special kind of privileged point of view of which I think the problem is that the people who are like religious people or like, not that same, they always did. Basically, they're colonizing the country the same way that the British colonized when they went to Asia, and they presented themselves as the neutral people that adjudicate between all the different communities in India, for example. And so and the same thing happened. I'm firsthand familiar with it in Malaysia and Singapore. They use British law because, you know what I'm saying? Because it's the law that came from somebody who doesn't live there at all. And so it's like the neutral one, but it's actually not neutral, it's the British. So with the liberals inside the country, you have it. I mean, they take this sort of neutral position, and through that pretense of neutrality, right, are then able to take a kind of privileged position of power, which I think other people feel excluded by. That's why they're saying, take our country back, because the rednecks, they feel what it now feels like to be colonized. You want to just grab the redneck and say, now you know what it's like to be colonized. Admit it, right? But they still want to think that they're the white guy. Yeah.
It's tough. It's fascinating how you sort of describe that, all of that. It's very much actually in keeping, for me it's interesting to know, very much in keeping with a lot of descriptive formulae that Foucault used. He has this concept of biopower, and it's a complex idea which I'm not going to do justice here, but what comes into that certainly is the marriage of, simply put, biology and power, and how that sort of pervades all aspects of life, and it's not just in the context of medicine. Biology is sort of more encompassing, in sort of Foucault's understanding of things. And it's interesting also how you described the sort of pretense. The language that you used was the pretense of objectivity or neutrality. Under that pretense, a lot of morally invested ideas are coming through, and Foucault doesn't necessarily use I mean, for him, morality is, in the modern sphere, morality is kind of done away with. It's vacated, right? But it always has, unsurprisingly and inevitably, it always has real world effects. And those real world effects always have a moral dimension. It doesn't matter, I'm kind of, repeating some of the things you said, but these are very, very important points. It doesn't matter if we have a Fauci coming to the fore with his sort of medical background and saying, this is for the greater good. And to your point again, the greater good according to whom, right? The greater good according to what standards? Right, really, I mean, none of this has been spelled out, and this is a huge, huge problem. And the word, one of the words that you also used, technocracy. We're living in a technocracy. There's and increasingly, this is certainly my sense, and some people that I've benefited from over the years, they've been sort of pointing to the increasing centralization of these technocrats in terms of their control and power. I mean, it's fascinating for me to reflect, just as a factual, as far as brute facts are concerned, right? That a technocrat, without any question, like Bill Gates, is the second largest donor to the WHO, right? And he refers to Fauci on a first name basis. Right, this is very, very interesting to me. Bill Gates, who literally, if we get down to it, has zero qualifications to speak to this issue, as far as the health of the entire globe is concerned. Let's not forget, right? He's been reported time and time again from the get-go as saying that, and I don't know to what extent this will actually pan out necessarily, but the fact that he's saying, and the fact that he's getting airtime in major outlets, right, news channels and newspapers and so forth, that until the entire world is vaccinated, the lockdown won't end. And he's been saying from the get-go, it's going to take 18 months. And many people have picked this up and repeated it. Again, I don't know to what extent it'll be successful. But to the point to your point about this sort of technocracy, in a sort of liberal language, I'm not sure if they're truly liberal, to be honest, because the liberal in the old school sense has very different value systems, right, as compared to, I don't know, in a technocratic contemporary sense. But all of this that's unfolding as we speak, and again, it's still happening, and the final story hasn't been written. It's still to come. It's very worrying to me. It's because these people don't. Which country was it again? I came across one of these articles where they're saying, was it in Germany that they're actually they have been or are employing philosophers to help think through this whole issue? That's amazing, right? That almost sounds like a joke, right? It's like, that is impossible, but this is exactly what's necessary, right? If philosophers can't speak.
When you mention it, I kind of wonder what's the framework they're working under, because as you said, there's always something there's a limit to the discourse.
Yeah. But it's at least something, right? It's something much better than what we have. I mean, I'm in England. There's no sense of philosophy traditionally whatsoever to how things are being worked out. It's. I mean, there's always
medical ethics board, right?
Pardon?
I mean, you have philosophers working on medical
ethics. Right.
But it all seems to me very technocratic in nature, because you have a few certain theories that you can apply. You apply them as you apply tools. That's how it looked to me. I mean, so you have utilitarianism, deontological ethics, some different things. You apply them as you apply tools to come up with an administrative, basically, decision that can be defended in ethical terms in the way that somebody can be sort of defending themselves in legal terms. Right? This is very technocratic. This is not really a matter of drawing you know, drawing what I would call a reasonable and inspiring, shareable value outlook, I guess, from an understanding of nature. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Right? Basically, it's a matter of, the problem is deriving for the ought from the is.
Right.
We've assumed that we cannot get the ought from the is, but I think this is the problem, you know?
For the benefit of listeners.
It's not one place, but the is under the control of Bill Gates.
Right.
And you know what? As long as we were continue to talk about the conspiracy theories, you know what I mean? If we're limited all the time in our discourse to talking about who's in control and what they're trying to do and how they're trying to do it, right? Rather than actually talking about what we ought to do as a community.
Exactly.
Group. What are the values that, how we should value life, you know? Because this is a life we share. We actually can't go on pretending like the big question about what is valuable about life, what is the meaning of life, is a kind of a private matter. Because actually the questions that come, what should we shut down in order to preserve the public health, and what do we need to keep open even at the risk of public health? This all comes down to really when we want to know what is essential and what's not essential as we're talking about it. Well, how can you answer the question what is essential and what is not essential unless you know what life is for? You know, I mean, what is the you know, what is essential in living, so to speak, right? I mean, it's easy to say some things, of course, these are essential for survival, you know what I mean? And these are not. We have to have the food stores open. But then we have the grocery store open, but we have the church not open. And again, I'm for, and I'm actually happy that the Muslims have complied and not open the mosques and all this. I think basically because of the public health danger and the way we understand our religion, you know, everything that we need, we can actually accrue spiritually and religiously in our own homes in these cases when we can't go to the mosque. This is not an issue. Even they have closed the Hajj, you see what I mean? Yeah. But at a certain point in time, let's say that it continues. Let's say they want to shut down the Hajj forever. See what I mean? Let's say they decide, oh, you know, we're never going to have a vaccine for these kind of diseases. And it's like a permanent new reality. Like everybody's excited about to say, this is our new reality. And they like it. They like it.
Isn't it interesting how these catchphrases
like
just seem to
virus now, and because I'm staying at home and watching Netflix all the time, suddenly I've achieved this new state of human consciousness, and all human beings know it's important now, and we're all loving each other. That's bullshit. What kind of a hippie dream California shit is this? You know, I'm going to.
It's not even that though. I wish it were a hippie sort of California dream type stuff. You know, this is like, I mean, the word that keeps cropping up for me, and you mentioned it already, is the word technocracy. And for the benefit of people listening, if they don't necessarily know the word, how would you define that word? I don't necessarily have a definition to hand. How would you? Because it's a fascinating term to help us think through things, right?
Right. So I guess we could take it back to, you know, Aristotelian, right? Because techne is Aristotle's, you know, distinction between episteme and techne, right? So you have episteme, which is knowledge of how things are as they necessarily must be, right? Sort of basically core axioms of reality. Techne is how to do stuff. Techne is knowledge of means. How can I achieve this or that aim, right? So ethics for him is a kind of episteme, you know, it's a knowledge of what you ought to do, what the good is for the human being. You know what I mean? But techne is something totally different. How can I achieve that good? That's what he presupposed, that I have answered the question what I should aim at.
Right.
So that's what I guess I mean. We have a society and an education system and a system of knowledge, I guess.
And in Aristotelian ethics, just so to interrupt, and in Aristotelian ethics, as you suggested, am I hearing you correctly? I'm remembering correctly, that techne becomes a means to realizing the higher, like the episteme or the higher purpose of, right? Techne is married or in the service of, right? Right. But
it's like asking the question, what is a good person? What is a virtuous person? As opposed to how can I become a virtuous person? They're both related to ethics, but they're different. Yeah.
And what do we have with technocracy though? Because that's like classical ethics, right? And the Muslims adopt Aristotle and as much as Christians do, and so many people throughout the world through history. The Chinese have their own sort of thing, which is not very different actually, but right. So the Buddhists as well, and the Hindus. But what do we have in a very sort of modern contemporary context where technocracy is devoid from, and the end goal is not the realization of some purpose beyond. Sorry, I'm sort of, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but yeah.
So we can marry technocracy easily with utilitarianism as an ethical theory, right? So that the good is just whatever the individual subject wants. You see what I mean? Like basically, there's not an objective fact about it. It's completely a matter of fulfilling desires and reducing suffering. You see what I mean? And so then everything else is just figuring out what will maximize that. So that's the very technical bit there. So I guess what I mean by technocratic society is in one where in the public sphere, the actual questions of value are sort of removed from the public sphere, and those are considered to be relegated to the private, so that each individual comes to the public sphere with already his, let's say, decisions about the nature of the good, yeah, and then he comes to the public sphere in order to sort of maximize or to, put his input into the deliberative process of, let's say, maximizing the goods according to how he conceives it. But the actual discussion about what is good and why it's good, is not something which can be answered in a public way, right? There's not a good for all human beings. It's all sort of so what's left is technocracy. What's left is the question of means, how we can achieve it.
And to take it again, this is inevitable for me. But to think through Foucault, the ideal that you've sort of just described, the ideal where the individual decides for himself or herself. From a Foucauldian point of view, even that is not happening. And I think Foucault helps us significantly in thinking through some of these things, not least of all the question of technocracy, because he has this idea of subjectivation, whereby the subject is formed through the disciplinary mechanisms of the society of which he or she is a part. And he or she, by virtue of that formation, which is pre-rational, right? Or even beyond. It's the very fact. I mean, he doesn't necessarily use this example, but he uses famously the example of the school and the prison system and factories, and he looks across these very seemingly divergent spheres and shows them incredible similarities between them in terms of the formation of the subject. In the school context, and this is an example I've had some thoughts about over the years, where just to think about, you're sitting on a cushion right now on the floor, right? Which is very different from sitting in a chair, which is what I'm doing. Like it seems like a very simplistic example to use, but I think it's actually, sometimes the simple example is going to be very profound. It assumes in a philosophical sense, but also it's creative of very different subjectivity. Like just on a purely biological level, physiologically, how we're formed. I happen to do some yoga just to kind of try and stay in touch with, some deeper aspects of myself. But like that's a very different experience as opposed to sitting in a chair, right? And it's creative of a different subject, right? To use kind of type of Foucauldian language. Now, again, staying with Foucault, he has the example of the factories and the schools and the prison system, right? He has the famous example deriving from Jeremy Bentham's Panopticon, right? You have this ideal prison system which has the central watchtower surrounded by these backlit cells. The prisoners can't see this watchtower, but they have this sense of always being watched, that anyone can be watching them at any one time. And the ideal sort of in the ideal in this ideal model of the panopticon, it's only necessary to have a guard watching over everyone. So that is formative of a particular subjectivity, as Foucault would say. And the technocratic model, as far as I can see, reading many people have been writing about this over the years, and unsurprisingly so, like the very fact that we have cameras everywhere, London, where I'm based right now, is after Beijing, I understand it's the most surveilled city in the world. There are literally cameras everywhere. What does that do to our sense of self? The very fact that Facebook, right, and all these sort of online platforms have very complex algorithms which are totally secretive, right? They never divulge them. That actually actively shape who we are on a constant basis, right? Famously, Facebook a few years ago, it was later revealed after the fact, they did a social contagion experiment, right? Where they wanted to see if they can literally manipulate how people felt. And then they kind of came under some backlash because of that. But how often are they doing that where we don't find out about it, right? So my point, I guess, to all of this is that the technocratic structure and system is such that it's run by a handful of people. Right, I came across again another article on Facebook. The sort of the irony of it is not lost on me, right? On the one hand, I'm railing against Facebook, but then I use it as a tool. That was it. 8 people own 40%, is it, of the world's entire wealth, and these are technocrats, right? So, so I would contend, I mean, to finish the thought, that the individual no longer is even getting to necessarily think through what he or she wants, because we're always being, our subjectivity is always being shaped without our knowledge. So people who rail against religion as being this stupid thing, it's from the Dark Ages, it's backwards, you're following all these authorities. These are technologies of the self, to use that Foucauldian phrase again, which have been thought through and designed, if we use a sort of evolutionary model of things, which I don't necessarily, that's not necessarily my perspective, but if we use that language, this stuff has been perfected over centuries, right? And it's productive of certain subjectivity, which is in tune with his or her episteme, right? Something that's beyond the purely utilitarian and mechanical, I would argue.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I there's a number of things. I totally agree there that people are not actually being, let's say, making their own value judgments. I mean, they are in insignificant ways. But when it comes down to it, right, the machine of, well, it's the machine of capitalism, you know what I mean, which is the technocratic machine here. In the end, everybody has to act in such a way, ultimately, that what we call the bottom line, that to maximize the means, which is the money. See what I mean? Money is like a blank. It's not really a decision. It's just blank means. So, money is a sort of, basically the technocratic value. And
yes,
what it dawned on me that what we find interesting with this COVID-19 is that it puts economic growth and life itself in contradiction. You see what I mean? So it would be the case that we would think that we want economic growth in order to enhance life, and that we just want to expand more means, right? Produce more capability to actually pursue whatever values that I want to value. In that case, that's the kind of way that the liberals' capital way of looking at it would be. Oh, what's great about our system is that everybody can pursue their own happiness and their own values. See what I mean? And our system produces or maximizes the means of them to realize whatever value that you have. So that's there, right? But now, well, what happened? Now we have this disease, which, if you put it this way, we have to give up economic growth or life. You see what I mean? If we give up life, then all those other values that all that economic growth is supposed to be there for, as a means for, is nullified. You see what I mean? but we're actually having a hard time. I mean, when Trump and the Republicans say, no, we have to open the country, all that other stuff about cultural stuff aside, but at that level, those guys want to open the country because just the very idea of, you know, slowing economic growth or anything that reverses economic growth or sacrifices economic growth, it's not possible for there to be a value which justifies compromising that value. You see what I mean?
Also,
That is the technocratic value.
well, but also, is it not the case that a lot of these people on the right who are arguing, the sort of everyday people, that they're fighting for their right to not just get a haircut, but to actually go back to work, right? Because it's literally a question of survival for so many. I mean, this is literally a global issue, right?
Well, no, but think about it. I mean, it's not really a question of the survival. And this is where we come out with the unsaid thing,
Yeah.
which some of the progressives are saying now, you know what I mean? But
Mm.
basically, we can take care of people, right? You don't have to go back to work and risk your life. We could take care of each other without making us go back to work and risk our lives. There are things that have to be done that we can figure this out.
Like
But
with
for them,
with
so for
university.
them, the idea, for example, of getting a paycheck from the government every month is tantamount to death. You know what I'm saying? Because they've already been trained that the only value in life is what you make when you go to work, which is the
Right,
technocratic value. See, so if you tell the guy, "Hey, don't worry, you can stay at home and do what you want according to this plan," right? I don't know. Rashida Tlaib say, "Let's mint $2 trillion coins," right? Mint $2 trillion coins and just spend that money. Well, let's see what happens, right? This is the way the economy's been working all this time anyway. So why not use some of that made up money to spend on things that people need rather than atomic weapons? You see what I mean? I don't see it. I don't see the radical. I don't see how that idea is radical, and that's how the economy's worked anyway. But this is an economics thing, and I'm not an economist, right? But what I do see is that if you tell the person that you can stay home, you don't have to go to work, we'll take care of you, and you can pursue your values, you can pursue your happiness, but he doesn't have any other happiness to pursue other than being the one who pulls himself up by his bootstraps and goes to work and earns everything he has and being the self-made man. That's all there is for him, and that's not a reality.
Do you think? No, that's fair. I think that's a fair retort on your part. Do you think at the same time that there's something to be said for the, as it were, the Marxist point about, and not that this is what happens in practice at all, but in the ideal sense that the human being, the question of alienation, right, being alienated from that which one creates, right? Now, the very fact, I mean, this is like alienation maybe on another level, one could potentially say. Like if we have UBI, Universal Basic Income, that like literally money is just coming in from me doing literally nothing but sitting at home watching Netflix. Do you think there's something to be said for the need on some level for the human being, he or she, to actually work, irrespective of a capitalist framework or what have you, that we need to be doing something productive?
I think so.
Yeah.
And I think that is part of it. I don't think it's good to say that everybody stays at home, but it seems like, I imagined, and I'm not, I don't think through the details. I don't have expertise to think through the details, but I do imagine this as getting together as a society and not trying to figure out simply how we're going to, let's say, open up the same kind of economy again, but actually thinking of it in these terms. What do people need? We need to actually have healthy activities. We need to feel like we're doing something worthwhile. We need to feel like we're contributing to something worthwhile. But does that have to be in the framework of I go to work and get a paycheck? You see what I mean? Now we have this crisis, this COVID, pandemic crisis, and that means that certain activities have to be curtailed. But can there be new activities that we can come up with? You see what I mean? So it can be done safely, and that it actually contribute to what we need in life, and
So,
as we sort of work it out between
so
ourselves.
interestingly enough, paradoxically, one might add, if this analysis turns out to be the case, but which I'm about to suggest, paradoxically, this has been what the sort of technocratic types have been saying for some time, right? That with the increasing perfection, with automation and so forth, with the increasing perfection of these sort of artificially intelligent systems, people will be increasingly freed up from their everyday, day-to-day menial tasks to do what is more enriching for them and so forth. And I don't know to what extent that will actually pan out. It would be ironic if that actually happens, but the very fact that automation, it's projected, right, has been projected by experts to do away with 50% of jobs in, I think it's projected in the next 5 to 10 years. I can't remember the exact framework, but definitely not more than 10. It could be even just 5 years. 40 to 50% of jobs will be gone. And this is pre-pandemic, right? From things as seemingly menial as driving a truck to even flipping burgers, right? They have robots that flip burgers now, to the very specialized, what was historically specialized work of surgeons, right? And radiographers and lawyers even. I mean, this is really weird. Like, irrespective of what we're going through right now, which is hella weird, to put it mildly, right? It's almost as if, and I don't think this is my conspiracy theorist mind, but I certainly have something of a conspiracy theorist lurking there somewhere. Maybe a degree of skepticism vis-a-vis mainstream narratives is always not an unhealthy position to maintain. But but I don't think it's that hat that I'm wearing right now when I say that. What was I going to say? Oh, so I almost see the pandemic as this, and it was put by Arundhati Roy like this. I'm sort of using it slightly differently. The idea of being a portal into this new world that we're apparently going into. It's like, I think that we are inevitably, if all these analyses are to be taken seriously, which they have to be taken seriously, that have been mentioned time and time again over the years, that we are entering a new phase of humanity, right? As a result of automation, roboticization, artificial intelligence, and so on and so forth. Maybe it's almost like the perfect, I don't want to say perfect, but it's almost like the perfect storm, to use that phrase, of things to bring us to this new chapter. Whether this new chapter necessarily happens, immediately post-COVID or not. And I think new chapters don't happen overnight anyway, they unfold over time, right? But did you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, I guess when I think about that automated future, the whole question I have then is, what happens to all the redundant people, right? I mean, most of the people are redundant. And so we only have two choices. Either they have to be basically eliminated from the system because they're redundant, or the whole logic of the system has to change. You see what I mean? I mean, right? I mean, it seems like, you could have Jeff Bezos and his, few friends. And after that, you could have, automated his automated burger flipper, his automated everything else. And what do we need the rest of us for? You know what I mean?
I think this is a serious question. No, I think it's a serious question that I wouldn't be surprised if some very serious people are posing. I wouldn't be surprised if they are posing this question. Because from a purely technocratic utilitarian, technocratic and utilitarian aren't necessarily the same thing, but I'm using this, somewhat equating it, that from a purely pragmatic point of view, right, that if it's just about my bottom line, if it's just about lining my own pockets, and human beings in and of themselves don't really have much value apart from being cogs in a machine. If those cogs can actually, if those particular human cogs can be replaced by machines as such, then really what is the point in all these people? And if they're such a suck on the environment, I mean, this is like the thing that we hear time and time again. But I can't help but notice the language, again, being super sensitive to language. It's used all the time, right? Even in the what's his name, Michael Moore produced documentary, right, about the environment. I forget the director's name, but it came out, it was released on Earth Day. Very interesting documentary, which sort of exposes how all these apparently green technologies are not green at all. They're using, chopping down entire forests. And this sort of biofuel is just, it's just a pretty name for extremely environmentally damaging fuels and so forth. Even in that documentary, there's this phrase that kept, this idea that kept cropping up, that human beings essentially are a blight on this earth. They're a virus, right? I mean, and this is not traditional language at all. This is certainly not Islamic language. It's not Christian language. I mean, in Islamic language, human beings are caliphs of God, every single human being. In Christian language, we're all sons and daughters of God. How can we be a blight on the earth? But this is the language that gets promoted time and time again. I mean, I'm very, that sort of rubs me the wrong way. And it's totally normalized in liberal circles. So if that language is normalized and it's said there are too many people in the world, right? Human beings are destroying. No, it's not all human beings. It's actually these corporations led by a handful of human beings. And if we don't even want to talk about corporations, okay, fine. But I think we should. Let's talk about people who are an actual suck on the Earth's resources, which are people in the West and people in the rest of the world who live like people in the West, right? The poor Bangladeshi, my parents were originally from Bangladesh. The poor average Bangladeshi is not a suck on the environment, at all, right?
But when people say that, the people who are saying that human beings are the suck on the environment are the ones who actually are, and the people who they are thinking of are the people who are not.
Yeah.
It is.
Typically brown and black people.
They're thinking of all these masses of poor brown people across South Asia and how we can feed all these people and how none of them are useful for me at all. That's what's going on in their minds. I mean, that's what I feel.
Yeah.
But actually they're the ones that are in fact responsible for the blight on the environment.
Yeah.
Not simple people. I totally agree. I mean, this is my prejudice. I can't say if somebody asks me, how do you know what they really think? Well, it's, so
one just has to read history. One just has to read history. It's not complicated. As students of history and, people who study deeply and think, and we think for a living, right? It's an incredibly blessed sort of thing to have, but absolutely necessary. It's not rocket science, to use that. I don't know why rocket science became the most difficult thing in the world. I mean, I should say it's not philosophy, really. Because philosophy is much harder than rocket science, as far as I'm concerned. I might be biased, but...
Well, yeah. I guess I do feel like wanted to go back to the idea of moral reality.
Yeah.
And like I said, I'm not an expert in Foucault.
No,
and I think there's a lot more there for me to understand than I do. So I have a surface level of understanding of Foucault, which he strikes me as very much the sort of logical conclusion, or again, the concentrated version of this kind of liberal fantasy. I feel like I've gotten a sense of, at least let's not say Foucault, but the idea of a postmodern perspective where a person is so committed to the idea of personal individual freedom that they even want freedom from constraints of reality. Mm-hmm. You see what I mean? Mm-hmm. And it's not even constraints of society, but they want freedom of the constraints of reality. And that posing this sort of dichotomy of freedom and power, at least on a superficial understanding, my own superficial understanding, which probably is not Foucault's, because
Foucault's really a major critic of modernity. He's a huge critic, and he's a prognostician more in line with Nietzsche. Like when Nietzsche famously or infamously said, right, God is dead, everyone knows that one statement, but they don't sort of see it in context of his broader writing, that God is dead, you have killed him, right? Nietzsche rather is not, he's not someone who's promoting this idea. He's saying this is where we've come, right? And Foucault is very much in keeping with that line, and he actually benefits tremendously from Nietzsche's sort of genealogical approach to studying history. So Foucault is, he has major misgivings about the modern project. And this is why, yeah.
Yeah, I guess I was getting too complicated there, and to put it this way, I think it's possible we should consider maybe that there being parameters on the discussion, on the public discourse, and that there being some limits of things that cannot be said. You know what I mean? It's actually not necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes I'm looking what's going on now, and I'm seeing that it sort of speaks to the need for this. The problem is actually how such a thing actually comes about, how the parameters are, let's say how the parameters develop. I wouldn't say how the parameters are set, because when you say how the parameters are set, then you ask the question, well, who's the one who sets the parameters? Yeah. And then we get into, well, these 5 companies that own the media, or right? And then it becomes like, oh, you know, we're being oppressed, and there's this back to the same old modern situation where it's freedom versus power, I guess. You know, that's what I feel like. Or in fact, maybe there's a society, you know, if we say that we're, like, you know, as human beings, a social creature, we live in a community, then a certain kind of power is actually necessary for life. I mean, I can only be living as a human being within a framework of power that extends beyond my individual freedom and my own individual choice, but actually sustains me. You see what I mean? That being the case, you know, how does that power develop? Can it be in a healthy way or in an unhealthy way? Right? So it's not as if I need to be always opposing the power. Rather, the question is, how should we collectively exert the power, you see what I'm saying, that is required for us to be human beings? And that's what I'm saying. What I mean, another way to say that is that there must necessarily be a public moral reality, right? The question is whether that public moral reality is one which is, you know, veridical in some way, right? Whether it actually, you know what I'm saying, really corresponds to the real needs of human life and the real value of human life. I mean, and there can be 2 ways to look at it. Either one can say that human life has a specific meaning and value, and our public discourse is to discover that fact, or we can say that it's constructed, and what we do is have a public discussion which sort of creates a conception of the good life, which we share, and then on the basis of that sharing, we're able to make decisions about, for example, what to close and what not to close if the disease comes. You know what I mean? Because we sort of have a shareable understanding about what's important and what's less important based on a shared idea of what human life is. If we are human beings, we can only live a shared life, then it seems like we have to have a shared conception of what human life is, right? And so I guess what I want to do is to go away from, I guess, a sort of framework where, I mean, because, no, don't get me wrong. The problem is that there are powers who are imposing on us, you see what I mean? False and unhealthy things.
We have to take the discussion beyond that, right? Yeah. No, I appreciate it.
It's a matter of how can I oppose the power to make space for individual freedom. But no, it's how should we actually be exerting power collectively differently than what is in fact happening?
Yeah,
right.
That's
technocracy is exactly what gives certain groups that power, because if we can keep from ever actually speaking about what really human life is for, these real moral value questions in a public way, right? Then there can never form a kind of a collective, you know, based on shared values, which is in opposition to their. You see what I'm saying? If we're always talking about it in terms of violations of my individual space and my individual rights.
Sure. No, so Foucault, so Foucault, Foucault's not really interested in that. He's not really interested in individual freedom, because he'll say there's no such thing as individual freedom. He's not. Even the individual is this idea of the sovereign. Sorry.
kind of a fabrication. And
yeah, it's a myth, really, and he's really picking holes in the whole mythos of modernity, right? And this is why, for me, he's so important, and for so many other people. And the
yeah,
interesting
he's misused by many people and misunderstood by many people.
I think a lot of people certainly misunderstand him. He's not an easy thinker to wrap one's head around. He's not an easy thinker at all to master, because he's written so much and on so many things, and his views have sort of evolved over time, as with all the great philosophers as well. Um, um, he's a very, very astute observer of modernity, looking at, in particular, Western modernity. He's really a Western thinker, so that has to be put out there, of course. He's very attuned to the Christian history, in particular the Western Christian history. Again, he's not at all aware of Eastern Christianity, which is a different story entirely. And sort of bringing us to where we are today. Again, because he's also significantly influenced by Nietzsche. But to your point about having some, it's a very interesting way of looking at things, where recognizing that there is a type of framework that is, for want of a better word, overseen by a type of power, in order to then formulate, or to then come to a realization of a shared morality, which ties in neatly with the Foucauldian idea of power knowledge, right? That sort of dyad. And it also, to kind of repeat something I said earlier on about Foucault, which is often misunderstood, not recognized enough, that he was also very interested in the sort of productive aspect of power. That power isn't just this sort of, it just quashes all possibility other than what it's interested in. That it does have interesting things that come out of that in response to, in conversation with, in opposition to. And this is part and parcel, I guess, of the very human project, right? I'm a huge sort of I'm a huge sci-fi consumer of sci-fi, and I'm still on the last episode of the latest season of Westworld. I don't know if you've watched that, and it's very, very, for me, as someone who thinks a lot about artificial intelligence and digitality, and have done for about 5 years, very seriously, very actively. It's a fascinating sort of, really a Foucauldian understanding of where things are going, how things have been progressing. And I'm not convinced that it's all that fictional. And I'm not convinced that it's all that far into the future either, because a lot of these things that have been described in the show, we're seeing in nascent forms already. But what I wanted to mention, also related to Westworld, is, which again for me is a very Foucauldian thing, the ability for coming up with opposition, very productive forms of opposition. Maybe that language in itself is fraught, right? The sort of alternative narratives. And again, I haven't finished the last episode, so I'm not sure how it finishes, but it's fascinating that, and he doesn't use this language at all, but this is kind of my language in trying to make sense of Foucault, is that, and I'm sure I read this somewhere else vis-a-vis other people, it won't be new to you or to many people, that it's that within any system, the seeds of its own demise are already there, right? And I think that's kind of maybe a Marxist understanding of capitalism, right? That it will just end up feeding on itself. So I think this is true of any system, no matter how apparently perfect, no matter how apparently technologically or technocratically perfect. So there's that to look forward to, and really the human spirit, which all the traditions talk about in no uncertain terms, in using different modes of language, is utterly, at the end of the day, when all is said and done, is utterly is utterly transcendent, right? That it can never truly be defeated. And this for me is something that gives me hope as well, which is not, which is in keeping with a lot of what you said, maybe formulated slightly differently.
Yes.